Welcome back to Hamilton's Mythology Lecture number 4, and we now turn to Chapter 4, the earliest heroes. And here we're going to see now what Edith Hamilton will do for a number of chapters now, where she's just simply going to outline certain kinds of stories that are significant in Greek mythology. The first one is the Prometheus Io story, told by Aeschylus as well as Ovid. Prometheus is chained, of course. He has been punished by Zeus. And along comes this beautiful heifer or cow, and he immediately recognizes that it is not a cow. It is actually a woman who has been turned into a cow, and he begins to speak with her, and she tells her sad story. Io tells the story of once again Zeus being interested in a beautiful woman. He pursues her. Hera, Zeus's wife, knows that something is going on. Zeus tries to hide himself in Io in clouds, and Hera knows exactly what's going on. And so Zeus will change his girl into a cow, but Hera understands what's going on, and she requests the cow as a present, and of course he has to give her up. And now Hera, wanting to make sure that this young lady in the form of a cow never is allowed anywhere near Zeus again, brings in Argus of the 100 Eyes, Argus, the spy, and Zeus now has a problem. He calls in Hermes and he says, look, I need you to go down. I need you to tell a really, really long, boring story. Put all of those 100 eyes to sleep, and that way I can make sure that Io gets away. Well, this is exactly what Hermes does. It takes a while, and he finally comes up with a story about Pan, and he's able to finally put all of the 100 eyes of Argus to sleep, allowing Hermes to kill Argus. But the end of that story is fascinating as well, and you'll never look at a peacock the same way, because Hera will take the 100 eyes of Argus and she will put them in the peacock's tail, and that's why the peacock's tail has all of those eyes. It's kind of a fun way to finish it. But Hera's not done with Io. She will send the gadfly to torture Io, and Io is then tortured, running away from the gadfly, and of course this is how ultimately she bumps into Prometheus. She asks for some help, and Prometheus says two things. One, look, it's going to be a long life for you still, but ultimately you're going to find your way south. You're ultimately going to find your way to the Nile. But before you do so, the Ionian coast will be named after you, as well as Bosphorus, which means the ford of the cow. But ultimately you're going to have a son with Zeus. That son will be Hercules, the greatest of all men. And ultimately Hercules will be who will free Prometheus. So you have a nice ending to that story. Our second story is Europa, coming from the 3rd century Alexandrian poet Moschus. Europa is this beautiful daughter of the king of Sidon, and Zeus, no shock here, wants her. So he sends her a vision in which 2 continents are going to war over her. One is Asia, the other obviously, you know who that is, right? She wakes a little bit disconcerted and goes down to the sea to collect flowers along with her girls. And all of a sudden there's this beautiful bull that shows up with this wonderful smell to the bull. And the other girls are a little reluctant, but Europa is very interested in this bull, and she decides, you know what, I'm going to climb on his back and go for a ride. Of course, Zeus will then immediately run away with her on his back. But when he hits the ocean, he doesn't go into the water, and she immediately realizes this is no human, this is a god. And over the water she will run. Again, Edith Hamilton will reference this as the rape of Europa. Here, rape just simply means to take away, in the same way that Hades, for example, will take away Persephone down to the underworld, right? Zeus will take Europa away to Crete, which is of course a significant place because that's where he was hidden by his mother when the father Kronos was trying to kill him. And there in Crete, all kinds of famous things then will happen. There's all kinds of famous people associated with Crete because of this. where the Edith Hamilton will quote, "Glorious sons whose scepters shall hold sway over all men on earth, the island of Crete." Everything happened, of course, as Zeus had said. Crete came into sight. They landed, and the seasons, the gatekeepers of Olympus, arrayed her for her bridal. Her sons were famous men, Europa's sons. Not only in this world, but in the next, where two of them, Minos and Rhodanthius, were rewarded for their justice upon the earth by being made the judges of the dead. But her own name, of course, remains the best known of all, right? Europa. Story 3, we've got the story of the Cyclops Polyphemus, and a couple of interesting stories from the Odyssey, as well as a 3rd century Alexandrian poet, Theocritus, as well as Lucian. First of all, the story of Odysseus with Polyphemus. Now, we're going to hear this story again in more detail and set in context when we're studying the Troy tale from part 4 of Edith Hamilton's Mythology. Needless to say, Odysseus ends up then on the island of Polyphemus, the Cyclops, that one-eyed monster. He's a beast. And Odysseus and his men go into the cave, and they need food, and they start eating the cheese and drinking the wine of Polyphemus. They have no idea. Polyphemus shows up. He, of course, immediately demands that they say who they are. Odysseus says, "I'm nobody." Polyphemus says, "Well, here's what I'm going to do, nobody. I'm going to start eating your men, and I'm going to save you for last." Odysseus, of course, has a plan. His plan is to get Polyphemus drunk, and then when he's drunk, they will sharpen a large pole, and they will blind Polyphemus. But of course, they've got to get out of the cave because they can't move the rock, and the way they do it is, of course, by hanging on the underside of these large sheep. Polyphemus, Odysseus says, is smart enough to feel the top, but he's stupid and he won't feel the bottom. But Odysseus is one of those guys, we'll talk about him later in more detail, he cannot let it go, right? And so once he gets down to the shoreline in his boat, he screams at Polyphemus, "Yeah, you stupid monster!" Of course, Polyphemus then finds out that it's Odysseus who has blinded him. Prophecy has been made that Odysseus will blind Polyphemus. Polyphemus almost jacks all their ships by throwing huge boulders at them, and ultimately Odysseus gets away. Of course, this will explain why Odysseus ultimately ends up almost drowning before he ends up on the island of the Phaeacians and all of that. We'll get to those stories because Poseidon, the father of Polyphemus, is none too pleased that his son got blinded. In another story, which is interesting, and this is the Galatea story with Polyphemus, he's got his eyesight back. And a beautiful sea nymph, Galatea, he is in love with. But there's a problem. He is hideous and ugly, and she is beautiful. And he is pathetic in these stories. He's not this disgusting kind of monster of the Odyssean story, but rather he's kind of pathetic. We here have, of course, the story, the motif of the Beauty and the Beast. The Greeks clearly liked this idea. Remember, we said earlier that the most beautiful of the goddesses, right, Aphrodite, is married to the lame and ugly Hephaestus. So this Beauty and Beast idea is one that the Greeks will definitely play games with. Why is it the case? I'm not saying this happens at Worland High School, but every once in a while we'll hear some guy say, "The ugliest guys in our school get the best looking girls." What is that all about? Well, the Greeks will play the same game. Galatea is not interested in Polyphemus in our first story that's told. She neglects him. In the second story that's told about Galatea, she has a sister named Doris, and Doris and she exchange a conversation about Polyphemus. Doris actually is kind of interested in Polyphemus, but Galatea, although she herself doesn't want to be with Polyphemus, she can't abide her sister sea nymph Doris being with Polyphemus, and so the two of them exchange words enough that Doris is no longer interested in poor Polyphemus. Polyphemus ultimately will never love anybody but Galatea, and she will never love anyone, certainly not Polyphemus. The final stories of this chapter are what are called flower myths, and we've got 3 of them: Narcissus, Tysyna, and Adonis. And all 3 of them are flowers in Greece. I should point out that Greece is a hard country, and so much so that any kind of wildflower is going to be really respected. Because it's such beautiful writing, I'll read this to you. This is Edith Hamilton's observations to set up these 3 stories. In Greece, she says, There are most lovely wildflowers. They would be beautiful anywhere, but Greece is not a rich and fertile country of wide meadows and fruitful fields where flowers seem at home. It's a land of rocky ways and stony hills and rugged mountains, and in such places the exquisite, vivid bloom of the wildflowers, a profusion of delight, gay, bewilderingly bright, comes as a startling surprise. Bleak heights are carpeted in radiant colors. Every crack and crevice of a frowning crag blossoms. Beautiful writing, yes? The contrast of this laughing, luxurious beauty with the clear-cut, austere grandeur all around arrests the attention sharply. Elsewhere, wildflowers may be little noticed, but never in Greece. That was as true in the days of old as it is now. In the faraway ages when the tales of Greek mythology were taking shape, men found the brilliant blossoms of the Greek spring a wonder and a delight. Those people, separated from us by thousands of years and almost completely unknown to us, felt as we do before the miracle of loveliness, each flower so delicate, yet altogether covering the land like a rainbow mantle flung over the hills. The first storytellers in Greece told story after story about them, the flowers, how they had been created, and why they were so beautiful. It was the most natural thing possible to connect them with the gods. All things in heaven and earth were mysteriously linked with the divine powers, but beautiful things most of all. Often, an especially exquisite flower was held to be the direct creation of a god for his or her own purpose. So we're going to look at three of these myths. The first one is the Narcissus flower. Of course, this is purple and silver flower. There's a couple of stories here that will be told. First, that Zeus created it to attract Persephone so his brother Hades could take her down into the underworld. It's an interesting story. The second story is about the young, beautiful boy, Narcissus. Now, Narcissus is so unbelievably beautiful, but ironically, not interested at all in any female attention. So he's got all these women falling down all over him, not interested at all by them. And because of this, you have interesting stories that will play out. For example, Echo, the beautiful nymph, who she wants to be with him, but she cannot attract him. He's not interested in her. Echo is interesting in herself because the beautiful nymph has caught the eye of the goddess Hera, who is thoroughly convinced that Echo and Zeus have been a thing. And so Hera will curse poor Echo, of course we know this word and this will make sense, to repeat only the last word ever spoken to you, right? Ever spoken to her. So, for example, Echo will have someone say, "How's it going?" And the only thing she can say is, "Going." In other words, all she can do is repeat the final word or words spoken to her, right? So, still though, Echo has a plan, right? So she leads Narcissus into the woods, and Narcissus makes sounds, and Narcissus says, "Is anyone here?" To which, of course, Echo can then say, "Here. Here." And then finally he will say, "Come out," as in come, come. And Echo will then repeat, "Come, come," leading him along. But ultimately, he still rejects her. He looks at her and he says, "I'm not interested in being with you." And she then will waste away so that now she's only a voice, nothing more. A rejected woman, however, prays about Narcissa, "May he who loves not others love himself." And the goddess Nemesis, which is translated as righteous anger, decides, you know what, Narcissus needs to get his. A drop-dead gorgeous guy who treats all women who like him as if he's nothing needs to get his. And so Echo watches as Narcissus is led into the woods to look in a pool, and the minute that he sees his own reflection in the pool, two things happen. One, he immediately identifies that he is without question the most stunningly beautiful thing he's ever seen. And two, he realizes, well, these women have been following him around all the time. But he can't look away. And all he can do is look at his beautiful image and he wastes away slowly. Now, of course, a 3A observation here. We'll remember that in our study of Milton's Paradise Lost, when Eve is created, she has a tendency to do the exact same thing and to look at herself in reflection. Only God's voice, you'll remember through the angel, will lead her back to Adam, for whom she has been created, you'll recall, right? Well, ultimately Narcissus will die. He wastes away looking at himself, and his final words are actually farewell, farewell, echoed by Echo, of course. In Hades, in fact, the storyline goes that when he's on the boat going across the river into Hades, he has to look over into the river one more time to see his beautiful reflection. Of course, in the end, he will become and be remembered for the beautiful purple flower. Speaking of flowers, our next story is Hyacinth. Hyacinth is another flower that is going to be remembered for the death of a youth. Hyacinth is Apollo's pal, and they're out throwing discs together. You'll, of course, remember that the Greeks invent this idea of throwing the discs at the Olympics and all of that. And in one version of the story, Apollo hits the poor boy in the head, and the blood is coming out of the boy's head. And it's an interesting kind of touch that as Apollo is cradling the young boy, who he very much loves and wants to continue to be friends with, the head of the young boy, Hyacinth, falls backwards like the stem of the flower of the head of the flower, as if it's broken off of its stem. The blood, of course, of the youth will become the flower, inscribed with the word in Greek, alas. It's interesting that this story immediately, and the word alas, reminds us of a couple of offerings by T.S. Eliot that we've spoken of in other lectures. You'll remember that in the opening lines of The Wasteland, Hyacinth's girl is mentioned, right? And as well, of course, in The Hollow Men, the word alas is mentioned in those opening lines. The other story that's related with Hyacinth is that the zephyr, the west wind, is blamed for blowing that disc into the boy's head, and the blood of the boy is then going to be the source of this beautiful flower. Hamilton pauses for a moment, and she makes a very interesting observation. What is up with these stories about beautiful children who are dying in their youth? Where does this one come from? She makes the observation that probably in many, many years prior to these stories, you have a culture that will, in the springtime, possibly sacrifice its own children, beautiful children, so that, with blood sprinkled on the ground, so that the fertility gods will in fact allow for a good growth, a good crop. And over time, then, these stories then will become kind of standard stories. We think of Fraser's Golden Bough, a text that I can reference for you if you're interested in this kind of thing, a text that had a lot of influence on the thinking of poets like T.S. Eliot in the 20th century. The line that Hamilton will give us is a beautiful line. A lovely miracle which made the cruel death seem less cruel. The way she says it is this: so they, the Greeks, would tell each other it had happened, the lovely miracle which made the cruel death seem less cruel. Then, as the ages passed, and people no longer believed that the earth needed blood to be fruitful, all that was cruel in these stories would be dropped and in the end forgotten. No one would remember that terrible things had once been done. Hyacinths, they would say, died not slaughtered by his kinsfolk to get food for them, but only because of a sorrowful mistake, a misguided disc. Our final story is Adonis, a story about another young boy dying and becoming a beautiful flower. Aphrodite loves Adonis. So does Persephone. They are warring as two women over the same guy. Zeus has had enough of it. So he says half the year Adonis will go down into the underworld and be with Persephone. And this is, of course, the fall and winter. And in the spring and the summer, then Adonis will be with Aphrodite. And therefore we have the growing of this flower, right? Aphrodite, when he was with Adonis, loved the chase, and Aphrodite will dress up like a huntress and run through the woods, and Adonis will go after her. But one day she's not with him when he's hunting, and he approaches a wild boar. He wounds the boar, but he does not kill the boar. The boar does kill him. And he calls out for help, and it will be in the end then Aphrodite who finds him. And these final words of this chapter are some poetry worth reading. Aphrodite speaks to Adonis, although she knew he could not hear her, and she says, "You die, O thrice desired, and my desire has flown like a dream. Gone with you is the girdle of my beauty, and I myself must live, who am a goddess, and may not follow you. Kiss me yet once again, the last long kiss, until I draw your soul within my lips, and drink down all your love." The mountains all were calling, and the oak trees answering, "Oh, woe, woe for Adonis, he is dead." An echo cried in answer, "Oh, woe, woe for Adonis." And all the loves wept for him, and all the muses too. But down in the black underworld, Adonis could not hear them, nor see the crimson flower that sprang up where each drop of his blood had stained the earth. Well, what are our final thoughts about this chapter? Of course, the power of a good story immediately comes to mind, especially at 3a. Think about the ways in which these kinds of stories get translated into text that maybe you're familiar with. For example, I'll just mention one. What about Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet? Of course, the story of Pyramus Thisbe we'll get to later, but notice that this idea about the death of young people and the significance of those deaths come to mind in any number of texts. Well, there you go, an introduction to chapters 3 and 4 of Edith Hamilton's Mythology. In our next lecture, we're going to turn to chapters 5 and 6 and her stories of lovers. These will, of course, be fun stories, and several of these stories, you're going to go, "Dude, I've heard that story. I just didn't know that that was the story." For example, the case of Narcissus. To call somebody narcissistic will mean what? Well, totally consumed with himself or herself to a fault, right, we might say. Thank you for joining me. I hope that you come back to join us for the next lecture of chapters 5, 6 of Mythology. Thank you.